Hello and welcome to our latest Meet the Adopter webcast. Our theme tonight is adoption and school. Our guests are Nicola, who's an adoptive mum and who works with teachers to help them understand the needs of adopted children. And we're also joined by Claire, who'll be sharing her experience as an adopted person in school. She'll also be talking about her work with the Coram Adoptables, a network of adopted young people who've developed an adoption toolkit for schools. As ever, we'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to join the conversation this evening, you can tweet at First for Adoption using the hashtag #MeetTheAdopter, or you can email. The email address is socialmedia@firstforadoption.org.uk. And if you're watching us on Facebook, like Claire's mum, you can take part by posting to the Facebook page. Claire, can we start with you? We know you're adopted, because I just said it, but can you tell us a little bit about the shape of your family?
So my family's quite odd, as everyone's are. I was adopted at the age of 3 as part of a sibling group, so I had an older sister that was 7, and then my parents went on to become foster carers when I was around 9 or 10, and 7 years ago we were given a baby that we've just never given back. And we've done it officially.
I should hope so.
So we then have foster children as well, so our family's big and loud and not...
And it moves in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. Okay. And do you mind me asking when you first found out you're adopted?
So I've always known.
Okay.
My parents very much operated and honesty is the best policy. And obviously with my sister being a little bit older, it wouldn't really have been feasible to keep it from either one of us or one of us. But I was quite religious as a child, so my mum used to tell me that it was the only way that God could get me to her. Tears.
It's a nice way of explaining it. We're talking about school tonight, so what was your experience at school like? And did it change? Did your sense of yourself as an adopted person change as you got older? Maybe it was different in primary school to junior school and so on.
So I very much split school into 2 different sections. I have the educational side of it where, not to pat myself on the back, but I excelled. And then the social side of it, which was quite a different story. I think in terms of the reaction to my being adopted, that very much changed as I got older. I found that as I moved through education, tolerance increased, but also the attitude towards it was different. So in primary school and the start of secondary school, it was very much a tool that could be used against me, whereas by the time I'd got to college and university, it really was just curiosity that I found from friends and peers, and people just really wanted to ask questions, but quite often it wasn't done in the right way. So I'm quite happy to talk about my experiences and always have been, but I can see how if the questions that were asked of me were posed to a different adopted person, that might present difficulties.
Nicola, we'll move on to you in a minute, because perhaps you can give us, with your not only your experience as an adopted mum, but your work with schools and other young people who've come from care or who are adopted, give us a more general picture. But I'd just like, if I may, to come to a question that's just come in for you, Claire. Laura has emailed a few questions actually for you. First one, what were the top 3 issues that you experienced at school? If you have a top 3, that makes it sound like the chart countdown, doesn't it? But were there 3 particular things that stood out?
So,
or maybe some that stood out?
In terms of the educational side of it, there are those awkward lessons that are awkward for any adopted child. So I found one in particular quite terrible. So in science, we were asked to bring in photos of our parents so we could discuss where genetic characteristics came from. So I thought when this homework was being set, that's going to be an issue for me. My parents are both blonde and blue-eyed and look nothing like me. So I went to the teacher at the end of the class and asked if I might be excused, and was told in a nutshell to just get on with it. And this teacher didn't know anything about me or my situation and brushed me off, more or less. So I found that quite difficult, because it was a difficult thought to think that a teacher wouldn't take the time to listen to why I needed to be excused from the homework. I suppose there have been a few arguments with friends that have turned sour when they've run out of things to say, and that has been the backup. And it's
They're
a bit...
going to go for the emotional jugular, so
It's a bit like a heat-seeking missile that, oh, I've run out of things that I can say to you, hang on, your parents didn't want you. And it's so much worse than your hair doesn't look very good today. It's something that I carry with me now at 22 years old, and that must have been at 11, 12. So it's obviously something that affected me and probably continues to, because I think because she didn't have the understanding of what adoption meant, what it meant for me personally, what it meant for anyone else, she didn't know that that was something that was quite hurtful to say. And I think, speaking in more generalist terms, I've always found it quite difficult socially to make and keep friends, and I'm overly sensitive, and I say that with massive emphasis, overly sensitive, and I take things very, very personally. So if someone were to be a bit quiet one day, I'd be sat thinking, what have I done? Have I upset them? Have I said something? Whereas other people just think, oh, that person's been a bit quiet. So I think I found that difficult because there's no lesson that tells you how to deal with that.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for the question, Laura. You were nodding a lot, Nicola, at some of the things. Were there several things there that rang true for you as a mother and as somebody who works with schools? Do you want to?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I guess I was nodding with quite a few of the things that Claire said, because my children experience those kind of things in secondary school now, where it seems to be the go-to place for people if they've got nothing else to say. And generally being adopted does, when people know that, which they generally do at secondary school, it becomes more difficult, because that's what they pick on like anything else. They always find something to pick on, don't they? And I think if you're also, I guess the added thing for a lot of adopted children is they may not be as academically capable as Claire obviously is. So they're also in the bottom sets, in with lots of other children who have lots of emotional and social difficulties and challenges. So the making and keeping friends is an interesting one to hear from Claire, because I know lots of children who gravitate towards each other because of that kind of sameness. You feel that kind of likeness with somebody who's come from a similar kind of background, even if you're out of that background now. So most of my children's friends are adopted, looked after, living in very difficult home environments. Those tend to be the kind of friends that they have.
Thank you. I've got another question for Claire from Debbie. Hopefully, I'm hoping there's a positive answer to this, having listened to those nasty instances. Debbie says, was there a particular teacher or a member of staff who supported you during your school years? And on reflection, these are long questions. On reflection, what was it about them, what did they do that was helpful? Was there anyone who kind of fought your corner at school, or you could confide in, that nice teacher who got it?
I suppose I didn't really seek that out. But there was a particular teacher that did know, my English teacher in my first year, that steered me towards particular stories that I might identify with. So I suppose in a way that was his way of providing me some support from another source. But I suppose I never sought out that teacher. I never tried to find that person, but there was never one that was glaringly apparent.
Okay. So you were quite self-sufficient. You had to be quite self-sufficient at school.
I think, to give them credit where it's due, I wouldn't have wanted it any other way. I've always been very anxious to prove what I can do for myself. So I suppose I made it a bit difficult for school to offer me support as well.
So I was going to ask you how supported you felt, and I think by the staff at school, and I think you've answered that. You weren't particularly supported. And is that because you didn't fit into some of those neat, very visible boxes that some adopted children do, in that you were okay with the school and homework, the academic side of things, so it was less obvious?
I often feel like I was the duck that looks absolutely fine above water, but underneath it's stressful, and it's nerve-wracking in school because it's so different. And I went to a primary school that had 100 pupils, and suddenly I was in a school where you had to move every hour, and there were people everywhere, and nobody knew anyone, and it was really stressful. But I've always been the type of person that would say, it's fine, let's just get on with it. This is what we've got, let's deal with it. But the only unfortunate thing for my poor parents was, when I got home, it was as if the duck had turned upside down. It was only the legs. So my poor parents did often get an earful after school of everything that's not working and nobody likes me. But credit to them, they were absolutely brilliant. I think I put more pressure on them than I did on school.
Okay.
I saw all my support from them.
Thank you. Nicola, I'm interested, we know you're an adopted mum. You talked a little bit about your family and other adopted children that you know as a mum and in the community and so on. I mentioned earlier that you work now professionally with schools on behalf of looked after children and indeed adopted children and other vulnerable children actually.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what it is that you're offering to schools that they need and perhaps don't know? Obviously, Claire's previous schools could have used your help. What kind of things are we talking about when we talk about the needs of adopted children? I know it's impossible to generalise, but there are certain things that pop up, aren't they? That
Yeah. I think it's having a general understanding that for some adopted children, not all, but some need a very different approach to the traditional educational system, particularly around behaviour modification kind of techniques, rewards, sanctions, all of that kind of thing can be quite hard for children who've not had a really solid foundation in those first early years. So for some children, their brains are wired in a different way due to the chaotic lifestyle in the early years. Which means that they are living in survival mode, really. So if they're in our school environments, if you think about a secondary that Claire just mentioned, where you've got lots of moving around and lots of things that could be seen as a threat to a child who's in survival mode all the time, when they're in that mode, they cannot access the part of their brain they need for thinking. So one day they might be able to do their times table and the next day they can't. And it's frustrating for teachers because they just think that kids are messing around or they're lazy, but that's not often the case. It's that they're frightened. And they don't understand that. So I've seen this actually in this first week as we've gone back to school. I've been reading lots of things on Facebook and with my kids as well. What's happened is teachers think, let's start out in let's put our foot down and get the kids to realise that this is how the year's going to be. So you get detention for being 5 minutes late and you get, all of those kind of things. But for children who are stressed out, as Claire just mentioned, very anxious about maybe being in that environment, had 6 weeks off, now come back into school feeling really anxious about that, to then have a detention for being 5 minutes late is just reinforcing what they already feel about school. And if teachers don't understand that, or staff in the school, then they're actually perpetuating that fear for them and not allowing them to learn, really. It's putting barriers up to their learning, really. So a lot of the systems have to change, which is difficult. They're not built for flexibility. They're not built for looking at individuals' needs. And it's really difficult. And many adopters will know this because I know that they spend a lot of time trying to go in and advocate for their child. I was in this morning in our school because our eldest is just going into year 11, and trying to make sure she has the support she needs. She's a child who doesn't. It doesn't cause a problem for them in lessons. She's very compliant, so she doesn't get the support she needs. And she won't ask for help, just like Claire has said. Yeah. She's very self-sufficient and self-reliant, but she does need that help. But she's not, she's not getting it because she's not asking for it. And if they don't see what's going on, they're not going to be able to help her to achieve the best that she could, really.
I hope that adopters watching know that state-funded schools in England can receive what's called pupil premium funding, and that helps them give extra support for all children who've been adopted from care. Yeah. It's paid to schools, isn't it, so that they can invest in specific support measures to address some of the issues that you're talking about that may be preventing them from reaching their potential. And there's lots of information about this on our website. For instance, let's allow a little commercial, is your work available via the pupil premium?
Of course it is, yeah. Okay. We go into schools and do on-site training. We'll do observations of children if they want a more kind of tailored approach to a particular child. We have lots of resources available. through our website. So yes, they can.
Good.
The frustrating thing, I think, is that figures have just come out really to say that people aren't using it. So there's funding available, and it's not being used properly, which is really, really frustrating.
It's important that people know it's there. And
Yeah.
just to be clear, Pupil Premium is available to all adopted school children from reception through to year 11.
Yep.
As I say, there are details on Pupil Premium, as well as lots of other useful information about adoption, about the Adoption Support Fund on our website, www.firstforadoption.org.uk. But I've got an email for you, Nicola. It's quite a long one, but I think it's important to read all of it. It's from Kerry MacDonald, who says, "It's my son's 4th year at primary school, and I'd love any ideas on how to get his teachers on his side. How do I get them to see his potential, to understand his need for extra one-to-one emotional support, and most importantly," and this chimes with something you said earlier, "give him less negative and more positive affirmations. The consistent punish and reward system is just so damaging for him, for his sense of self. My son berates himself quite enough without them rubbing salt into his wounds. He's so much stronger and more amazing than they give him credit for. Any advice on how to get them to see the light would be gratefully appreciated."
Yeah.
How long have you got? I know.
I know.
But,
Yeah, this is the difficulty, and I think most adopted parents would resonate with that. Particularly if you've got a child who doesn't display any difficulties at school. They may do at home, as Claire has just said. But within the school environment, they may be holding it in, desperate to be liked, and don't want to create a fuss. And then that's quite hard, I think, for staff to believe us, basically, as a parent, when we go in and say. And sometimes, I'm not saying this is the case for Kerry, because I don't know, but sometimes we don't help ourselves as parents, because we're often in there every day saying, you haven't done this, you haven't done the other. And for schools, they find that quite hard. So trying to build that partnership and that relationship is really key, and it is very difficult. Until a school recognises that they need to try and create an attachment-aware culture where they're aware of all the attachment needs for all children, not just adopted, it's really, really hard.
You mentioned attachment, which I'm sure most people watching this will understand. Anybody who was adopted, certainly within the last 25, 30 years, will have had to have become well versed in attachment theory and the notion of what it means. Are you able, sorry to spring this on you, make you sing for your supper, are you able to just explain for anyone who isn't quite sure, what do we mean by attachment and why does it rear its head in school, for instance? Yeah,
okay. So attachment basically is about how we relate to other people. It's not about bonding with our parents, but it's how we kind of fit in the world. So whether we trust people, whether we don't, all of those kind of things. And whether we have a secure or an insecure attachment comes from those very early years. So the first 2 years particularly of life, when what should happen is you have a need as a baby, you cry, somebody comes and meets that need, and in a good enough fashion so that you then understand that the world is a safe place, that I'm okay, that my needs will be met, and you start to trust people. When children don't have that, which the majority of children who've been through the care system don't, even if they went out as a tiny baby, they may not have, depending on their foster care experience. When they cry to get a need met and it's inconsistent in its response, what happens is trust doesn't develop, but rage develops instead. And they internalise that into shame. We talk about toxic shame. So that feeling, the reason that lad is responding poorly to some of the methods they're using is because he already feels bad about himself at the core of who he is. So, and that shows itself in lots of different ways. There's lots of shame-based behaviours which aren't maybe as obvious. There's the ones that are like running away and hiding under tables and things, those obvious kind of signs. But there's also overreaction to any kind of criticism. If you don't want to volunteer for things because, putting yourself out there is quite a difficult thing to do if you already feel bad about yourself. Not taking praise very well. So, and that's one of the things that schools really struggle with, because they think this child hasn't had a lot of praise, let's just gush them with praise about everything. And actually, because they don't feel at the core of their being that that's right, I know I'm bad, So they then go and punch somebody in the face. And people think, well, I've just given you a certificate and now you've gone and done something that's, do you see what I mean? Because it's not about behaviour modification, it's about relieving anxiety. And that's the big message that schools need to understand, is we need to change our thinking and think, how can I get this child to feel safe and to feel calm in the school so that they can learn? Instead of trying to make them behave in a certain way. It's kind of like puppy training, isn't it? I give them a sticker and then they'll sit, or they sit and I give them a sticker. That's not how we should be treating children, I don't believe. I think it should be relieving their anxiety and then they behave in a different way. I don't know if I've gone off the question.
No, you
attachment.
haven't. Absolutely,
Yeah.
attachment. I mean, for me, and I think it's important at this juncture to tell my colleagues at First for Adoption that I'm not about to hit them in the face, not today anyway, but as an adopted person, that so much of that rings true for me. I don't know whether it does for you, Claire. The duck, Claire the duck.
That's a great analogy.
There's some of that in there, isn't there?
Definitely.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of compliments or
Yeah, no,
positive
I've met
things.
you. I should confess that Claire and I have met before, and I've seen her complimented, quite rightly so, on a number of things, not least her amazing academic achievements and some other stuff. You don't like it, do you?
I dissolved into a pool of tears.
Okay, well, you cry and I'll ask a question to Nicola. And Claire picked up on this a little bit earlier. The story, the sad story that you told about one of the milestones of everybody's education, the lesson about genetics. Are there other flashpoints that parents and teachers can identify ahead of time in order to help make things easier for their adopted children in school?
Yep, there are absolutely loads, unfortunately, within the curriculum. I mean, in a general day or week, the free times tend to be the more stressful times for children. So, your breaks, your lunches and things, because you've got to navigate the whole friendship thing. It's not structured. There's not as many adults around. That's when my children get themselves into trouble, is in those break times. But in the curriculum, there's lots in the early years, all those child development things, family trees, any of the occasions throughout the year. So obviously Mother's Day, Father's Day, Children in Need, there's loads of them. Secondary, it starts to get more into the kind of subjects that they deal with. So my daughter took drama for her option. And they wanted her to do a play that was about a mom who had abandoned her 3 children by leaving a note in the cereal box to say that she'd gone, and to leave these 3 teenage children. And my daughter was expected to act out one of these, which, that's really hard to do. And then they moved on to domestic violence. So to actually have to really be doing a therapy session in your lesson with all your peers is really quite hard. But I also do understand that schools feel that those are the gritty things to talk about and the subjects that, create a bit of friction. But for children who've experienced those things and may still be experiencing it, obviously not adopted, but those who are still in a vulnerable home environment, that's going to be incredibly difficult. And it puts another barrier to learning. Because for my daughter, she can't succeed in that lesson if she's got to deal with all the stuff that's going on inside as well as the actual, the subject.
What you're saying suggests to me that it's massively important to have the right school.
Yep.
And if you're fortunate enough to find a school that you're able to send your child or children to develop a good relationship with that school.
Absolutely, yeah.
I might ask you, if you would, for a moment to ruminate on what people, if you can, what people should be looking out for.
Yep.
But I want to ask Claire something that was also suggested by what you just said, which is this idea of how, and I guess I might answer it myself, it might be about the individual child or children. How important is it, or advisable is it, for parents to flag up ahead of time with the school that an adopted child is coming into the school? And does it vary in terms of the age of the child, the personality of the child? Claire, in a way, didn't have a choice because her sister that's right, isn't it? She preceded you through the same schools?
As far as I understand, my parents did flag it up quite early because we geographically didn't move very far. So it was always a worry for them that we would encounter biological family in the school environment. So I think it was massively important for them, but also to flip it on its head, I always think of it a bit like sending a child off with a nut allergy. You wouldn't send them off to school not telling anyone that, and I know it's different because obviously that's medical and this is emotional, but I feel like it's giving parents a bit of a sense of comfort knowing that there's someone at school that will know that this family tree lesson might be difficult for this child, or someone that this child could seek out and say, look, I've had a bit of trouble with this. And also for parents to get feedback themselves. What I think my parents are finding difficult with our younger brother, our looked after children, my sister, is that they're sometimes the last to know. So there will be something that happens on Monday in school and they will get a letter on Saturday. So it's too late for them to deal with it. And by Saturday, that's then tainting the weekend. So it's very much about that communication between school and parents, and I think it's as much for the parents as it is for the children to have that open channel of communication.
Has that been your experience too?
Yeah, I totally agree. Yes, I think it's and it's difficult in secondary school because you've got so many staff to deal with. But I think if you have a key person in school, a key adult, or somebody who forms that kind of relationship with the child and builds a relationship with home, then yeah, I mean, we're never told of stuff that happens before, to say this is what we're going to be doing, just to give you a kind of heads up, but also when things happen after. I mean, in my experience, I've always felt that adopters, generally, we go kind of extremes. We might be very kind of don't want to tell anybody that our children are adopted and, it's their story, which it is their story. But sometimes that's not helpful, or then we might go the other way where we tell everybody and everybody knows, and sometimes that's not helpful. So I think the healthy place is somewhere in the middle, really, is to think that, who needs to know, what is the circumstance. As you say, if the children are older, so mine were 4, 5 and 7 when they came to us, so it was obvious, that they just kind of arrived. And also they knew that they'd come from foster care, so they kind of, like yourself really. So when they went into the school, and it was a small school, like you've said, so it was a nice nurturing environment. Everybody knew because there were 3 of them, so it was kind of obvious. When they go to secondary school, we've left it more up to them, but we do still have conversations with the key people. But what I have found is they don't necessarily tell other people, like the drama teacher, that sometimes that might be helpful for them to do that. Even just to say they're adopted, I don't want them to tell them all of their story because it's nobody else's business to do. It's their story. But to know that a child is adopted these days, there's a reason why, isn't there?
And in terms, going back to that question that we had, I forget who asked it, but about tips in terms of choosing a school. Oh,
choosing a school, okay.
Is there anything we can look at, adopted parents can look out for?
I would say in terms of primary, the smaller ones generally, the ones that maybe don't get such a great Ofsted report actually, because they tend to be the ones who are a little bit more nurturing occasionally. Ones where the head and the Senko understand what you're talking about. So what we've done is slip the word attachment in there, see if they even know what it is. Speak to other people that you know around, those kind of things, recommendations from other adopters. Secondary is harder. We went for one that's quite big, so ours went from 200 students in primary to 2,000 in secondary.
Is it like that for you, Claire?
Definitely.
Yeah.
I went from knowing everyone to knowing a person.
Yeah. That's difficult, but the reason we chose them was they had a really good learning support unit, which has proved to be good. So we have like a little school within a school. I don't ever talk to the head teacher. It's the learning support team that we talk to, and our children go in early. They've gone in early every day, go into that unit, so they don't go in with the whole rush of everybody else. They do their homework at school. They don't do homework at home. So we've worked out things with that learning support unit that will support our children. But they're quite an academic school. They're quite a pushy school. So sometimes they're not so great with some of the children who don't have maybe the same capability
How
in
are your
terms of
children
academics.
doing at school?
They're doing really well, yeah.
Good.
They're doing okay, yeah. I think so.
Claire, we should talk about your work with the group that I mentioned at the beginning, the Coram Adoptables. What do they do? What's that all about?
So the Adoptables is a peer network of adopted young people aged 11 to 25, and that's really about having people that are like you, that you can talk to, so it's very much knowing that you're not alone.
Some of the stuff that you could have really used when you
yeah,
were at
definitely.
school. Yeah.
And also we talk about changes that happen in adoption and adoption as it stands. We've given our opinion to government, and we're hoping to have a bit of an impact on how it's going to look in the future.
Actually, yeah, because I happen to know that you were at the Houses of Parliament last month.
Quite recently.
Which brings me on to my next question. Why were you at the Houses of Parliament?
So Coram Life Education and the Adoptables worked in conjunction, and they've developed a toolkit to be used in schools. It spans from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3, and they've developed lesson plans for PSHE lessons to be used that they're not even just about education, it's life skills as well. So it's all centred around issues that adopted children might face. There's things about having an item in school like a teddy bear or a blanket, and what that might pose for other children, what issues that might come with. And then there's also the lesson plan for the older children really focuses on how to ask appropriate questions, because when all the research was done, it was really highlighted that people want to know, they just don't know how to ask. A question I actually personally find really offensive is when are you going to look for your real parents? And if I'm feeling particularly prickly that day, I'll say, well, I'm going home at 3:30, I'll see them then. And people don't know how to deal with that, because they still want to know the answer, but you've given them this full sarcastic comment, and so they don't know what to do.
That
And
could be prevented by the substitution of one word.
Yeah.
It's not difficult, is it?
So it's again about tolerance and people knowing what to ask, how to ask, when to ask it. So I think the kind of message that I get from that is that it is okay to ask. You just really have to think about how you're doing it.
Great. And people can find out, as ever, more information about the toolkit, which is free, I believe.
It is.
Schools don't have to pay for it. On our website, the First for Adoption website, firstforadoption.org.uk, which links to the Adoptables website. Okay. I'm going to put you on the spot now, because we're almost out of time.
Yep.
We could, I know, talk for a lot longer, but we need to stop soon. Are there anything that's come out of this evening's discussion that you'd like to leave us with? Is there anything that you'd like to say to both of you, to an adopted person who's in school at the moment, maybe just started big school, secondary school, or the teachers who might be watching this or see this at a later date on the internet, or indeed adopted parents? Anything that you thought you'd like to leave them with, a piece of advice?
I think the advice from my own personal experience is really that shy kids get no. So there might have been support there for me if I'd have asked for it, because obviously resilience is all good and well, but when you're taking your sackfuls of problems home to your parents, there's got to be a better way, really. So I think hindsight is 2020, but if I'd have gone back, I definitely would have asked for help with the social bits that I found difficult.
What do you think?
I think there's lots of things, but I think there's two key messages for me for schools. One is that all behaviour communicates something. So you have to look past the behaviour. You know, if a child is anxious and they're showing it in lots of different ways, so they may be the ones who are, throwing chairs or making it really difficult for everybody. They may also be the ones who are, holding it all in and then taking it all home. So looking at, behind the behaviour, it's communicating a need. And then the other thing is, if a child doesn't feel safe and feel calm, they're not going to be able to learn.
This applies as much to parents as it does to teachers, doesn't
Well,
it?
yeah.
Yeah, to everyone around, look behind
Yeah.
the behaviour. And I think you made that very clear earlier when you were unpacking attachment theory and how that can manifest itself for us.
Yeah.
I'm sorry we haven't had time to answer all the questions that have come in this evening. As we said earlier, there is lots of useful information on our website about all aspects of adoption, including school. And if you'd like to talk to someone, of course, in confidence, do call our information line, which is open between 10 and 6 p.m. The number to call is 0300 222 0022. But that is all we've got time for tonight. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Nicola.
Pleasure.